So for those of you new to the podcast, I have for years been doing the podcast as kind of my full-time primary thing, and I have dipped into savings. I have cashed out Bitcoin, cashed out retirement accounts, but it has not yet become a full-time income. I say yet. So I'm picking up some extra work, professional gunfighting, as you might imagine, making that mercenary money to stack it up. But the goal is still, God willing, to make this the full-time income. So you're going to hear some more recycled content, some more tactical reload content. I thought of something new for this week, the 20th through the 25th. Go to the Patreon page if you've never been there. Sign up as a free patron. There's a thing to sign up for as a free patron. Now, a lot of that content usually I put out for paid members. But this week, if you're listening to this when it comes out, or in the future, you can go back and listen to this content. The content coming out from the 20th to the 25th every day. There will be a Patreon page exclusive content episode only on Patreon. You can sign up for free. I mean, if you want to sign up as a Patreon member, you've been thinking about it anyway, go ahead. But just to give you a little taste of what Patreon gets, you can sign up as a free member and get that content. So scroll down, hit the link, and get Patreon only content that won't come out on the regular podcast. To give you an idea of things coming out for the Patreon page only that week, End of the World 2024 episode. Water is not everywhere. Practical Tactical Fashion Part 1. Practical Tactical Fashion Footwear. Anyway, that's some content that'll be coming out on Patreon. Patreon only. So go to the Patreon page and sign up. Sign up as a member, check out the content that's only there, and enjoy this tactical reload. Gunfighters, welcome to Gunfighter Life. Today's a special treat. You may think if you just tune in and listen that it's easier to put out an old episode, but when you go back this far, back into a world pre-COVID lockdowns, back to a world where Donald Trump was president. Way back when I remember paying for something a flat, I believe, for 60 eggs. Back when I was still the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters is my day-to-day job, and I did this a couple of times a year on the side. To go back and remaster, clean up the audio, and do a bunch of editing on an old episode from January of 2020 in that far different world. It honestly was more work than just recording a new episode. But I thought this was a good episode. The AR versus the AK. I hope that you'll overlook some of the foibles in the audio quality and the fact that I said things like a lot more back then, as I was still much newer at the podcasting than I am today. I believe I recorded that on my iPhone, who knows what, with 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever, on my way driving to or from the range to do some training, and uploaded it. But spent quite a bit of time restoring it, and I hope that you enjoy it. I think a very good older episode that many probably haven't heard, because a lot of people probably don't go and scroll back to January of 2020. So maybe new for you. I hope you enjoy this episode. As always, I'm your host, Michael Milito. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That's number one in my life and everything that I do, and this podcast is no different, and I don't apologize for it. A little bit about me, my background. One of the reasons I got into doing this podcast is because I wanted to put out the things that I've been blessed to be able to do in life with a real-world experience. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, combat tours in Iraq. I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps. I also worked for LAPD, working some of the nastiest streets in the country. Obviously carried a gun successfully and came back, by God's grace, alive from both those different endeavors. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time. I am an FBI firearms instructor, a bunch of other federal government agency, 3 letters, certified instructors, anything from basic instruction to advanced weapons. Let's see. Hunted all over, from gray squirrels on the East Coast to the biggest elk in the country on the West Coast, and anything in between, anything from little tiny prairie dog to wolves. I've hunted them all successfully by God's grace. And let's see what else. Competition shooting. Did my first competition shooting in 1998. I've competed in rifle, pistol, shotgun. I've been very blessed to win a lot of different competitions in a lot of different disciplines. Enough about me. That's just giving you, the only reason I mention that stuff, I'm very humbled to have done all that stuff, but I mention it to let you know that this podcast is not just an opinion on some Facebook forum or something. It's based on, we all have our opinions and our favorites and our biases, and I do as well, but it's based on real world experiences and real world combat. I currently still gunfighting is my full-time job, and I just wanted to let you know that this is based on real things. My current full-time job, I'm blessed to be the commander, the leader of a fairly good tactical unit where gunfighting is our bread and butter, our day-to-day job. And I won't say what that is. This podcast is no way affiliated with that, and these thoughts and opinions are purely my own and not anything to do with my job. So I won't mention what that job is, but definitely part of my day-to-day life. Now for the topic. Today's topic is going to be a controversial one, a classic one, a great one. The AR-15 versus the AK-47. You might imagine on my bio, I have quite a bit of experience with both. Obviously, I've been made to shoot one more than the other. But I have used both in combat. I've used both platforms. Obviously, I have a lot more formal training on the AR because that's America's rifle. That's America's sweetheart. The AR-15, for good or bad, is as American as apple pie is. You know, Eugene Stoner and Sullivan designed that weapon. We think of it as like some modern weapon, but think about this. It was designed in the 50s, adopted in the early 60s. Think about what else was around in the 1950s. We think of it as this new, assault rifle design. It was a civilian gun, first of all, adopted by the U.S. military, developed in the 1950s, and adopted in the very early 60s. So think about that. Think about the cars that were around in the 50s. Great cars, but you don't still see them being driven today. But that's still America's go-to rifle for war, for police, for fun, more and more for hunting. That is, for better or worse, America's rifle. Now let's look at the AK. Unarguably, the most prolific battle rifle, small arm, of the 20th and going into the 21st century. Developed a little bit earlier in the 1940s, so about a decade older in design. That is the worldwide. When you think assault rifle, when you think, military small arm, you think the AK-47. From fighters anywhere around the world, the most common thing they're going to be armed with is an AK-47. And there's a reason for that. It is a great rifle. It does what it does very, very well. That is what it is. Designed by Russia, obviously. Designed by Kalashnikov, obviously. So, both very prolific. They are the two, small arms, for better or worse. Just as in America, the go-to rifle, is the AR-15, as American as apple pie. For the rest of the world, pretty much, that rifle, unless you went to Belgium, then maybe be the FAL or something. But for pretty much the rest of the world, that rifle is the AK-47. It is worldwide far bigger, far more successful than the AR-15. Now, to understand both weapons, I think you have to understand why, mainly, what was the thought process behind them? What were they designed for? Well, let's start with the AK-47. The AK-47 was born right after World War II. You look at the kind of country that Russia is. Russia was a developer and adopter of this. Russia is an enormous country. their army is mainly conscript soldiers, meaning they're not super well-trained professional fighting forces. And I'm not saying that to put them down. They're farmers, they're shopkeepers that get pressed into service, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very noble thing. This weapon was, and satellite states. So, Russia had a bunch of different things forming the Soviet Union, all from the far Asian people to, all the way over to Belarus. It's a giant, giant empire. And they had to arm all those different people speaking who knows how many different languages with a rifle that they could train somebody to use very quickly, very effectively, that weren't professional soldiers. And we see how effective they did this, because I'm not saying this is a good thing, but there are 12-year-old kids in Africa that successfully use the AK-47 to put men in the dirt. That's how simple that weapon is to use. It is as simple a repeating, effective assault rifle can be. Like, it is super simple. So it was designed for that purpose, to arm large numbers of people in conscript armies with an effective fighting tool. And the AK-47 does that, and it does it well. Coming out of World War II, Russia, we think of Americans losing a lot of people in World War II. Look at the numbers that the Russians lost. They lost a lot of people in World War II. And they didn't want that to happen again. They wanted a very effective small arm. They came from the Mosin Nagant. Ineffective, but, that rifle has been around since the 1800s. An older school, older philosophy, big bolt action, full caliber design, battle rifle, with an effective range of 1,000 meters. But most engagements take place far sooner than that. So they wanted a more rapid fire and really intermediate cartridge, which if you don't know what that term means, we're not going to dive into that today, but a cartridge that was effective at putting men down anywhere from 25 meters to 300 meters, and the AK does that very well. That's what it was designed for, and I think it accomplished that goal. The fact that we're still using it today in 2020 around the world shows that it accomplished that goal very well. The fact that a young, untrained child can use it and a Spetsnaz guy can use it that's very highly trained speaks very well of that rifle. Now let's look at the AR-15 and when it was designed and what it was designed for. AR-15 came about in the 50s, the full swing of the Cold War. Who were worried about fighting? The Russians. The Russians had large numbers of people. A giant army, especially with all their satellite states. Looking at fighting Russians somewhere in Europe, somewhere in the world. So that's a huge army. We wanted higher magazine capacity. You got to remember, we came from the M1 Garand, which was a great rifle, a full power cartridge, 30-06, capable of getting good accurate man-sized hits, out to 800, 1,000 meters if you do your part. But that's great, but most engagements in modern warfare, I speak from personal experience, happen at way closer range than that. And they happen at closer range than that than World War II. Even in World War I. But, sometimes change comes slowly, especially in the U.S. military. So it was designed to be a much higher capacity weapon. It went from an 8-round Garand to a 20-round is what it was designed for. The only reason they went to the 30-round is because, honestly, to keep up with the AK-47, because it had 30-round mags. But you're looking at, being able to carry 30 rounds of ammo, getting good accurate hits out to 500 meters, and the original M16, A1 and A2s, getting hits out to 500 meters, which is still much more than you need, and carrying 30 rounds of ammunition. So a light weapon capable of holding high capacity and ammunition, much higher than was seen before. In a lightweight package, it still, even with all that ammo, weighs far less. You're looking at, a 6-7 pound rifle versus a 9 to 10 pound rifle, and even more disparity when you look at the complete loadout and how much ammo you can carry. Also, it's important to note that it was a civilian company. The AR-15 stands for Armalite Rifle 15. It does not stand for assault rifle. Armalite rifle by the Armalite company, designed, and it was adopted to 223 from really the older 222 cartridge. And if you look at that in hunting application, that's a prairie dog cartridge. That's a small game cartridge. That's maybe a good coyote cartridge when it was designed, but not a full power cartridge by any means. And the thought process behind that was not, it was not to be able to put a man down and drop him like a sack of potatoes. It was to get a man out of the fight. And the thought prevailing at the time was wounding was just as good or better than permanently killing somebody. Because if you wound somebody, then you have to take them out of the fight, and it takes medics to treat them. So you're still taking the man out of the fight. You're costing resources. So as far as the army and the military is concerned, if you wound somebody, they were worried about, like I said, in the Cold War, fighting a uniformed combatant army that followed the Geneva Convention, that followed the rules of war. Because that's what we had been used to. We just got out of 2 world wars. And you're fighting a uniformed Russian army. That's what we were worried about at the time anyway, going to war with Russia. And if you wound one of those guys, they abide by all the things that go with, gentlemanly warfare, if there is such a thing. So wounding was the goal of that cartridge, the 223. And we'll talk more about the cartridges later, but the idea was to be able to effectively wound as many people as you could. The AR-15 obviously does that. The American military wanted to get good accurate hits out to 500 yards, which is a little bit farther than most people would consider good with the AK. If you look at the way the weapon was designed, it was not designed to arm conscript soldiers. It was designed to have a more highly effective, highly trained fighting force. And you'll see that in the maintenance of the AR. You cannot give the same amount of maintenance to an AR and an AK and expect the AR-15, M16 to run reliably. It just is not going to happen. It requires maintenance. It requires some level of training just to take the thing apart and put it back together. Whereas the AK-47, you could literally never take it apart and put it back together. So it's a different philosophy. It was designed to arm professional fighting force of American soldiers that have good logistics, good support. They have armorers ready to fix weapons. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, but the philosophy was different. They were designed for different purposes. And I think understanding that from the get-go will help you better understand and appreciate both weapons. They weren't designed for the same thing by the same people at the same time. So you need to understand that when you're looking at both. Next, we'll get into cartridges. The original cartridge, as far as I know, at least the one that was first commonly fielded for I'm not talking about like test loads, but the one that was first commonly fielded, I believe the XM193, for the U.S. military, for the AR-15, was adopted is a 55 grain bullet out of a 20-inch, the M16A1A2 barrel, coming out of there at right around 3,000, a little over 3,000, 3,100 feet per second. So you don't have to know what grains are. It's an old, antiquated unit of measurement from the Old English system that we really only use for bullets now and powder, but in the ballistic world. But it's a grain. Think of a grain roughly as like a grain of wheat. It's a small unit of measurement, but more is more. So a 55 grain bullet, that was the original loading, going at 3,100 feet per second. So the point of that is it's a very lightweight bullet. Like I said, for hunting standards, that's something you would shoot a prairie dog with. And I've hunted plenty of prairie dogs with the 223 cartridge. The 223 was adopted by the military and designated a 5.56 because we're part of NATO and NATO uses metric. So if you didn't know that, now you do. So it was adopted. It was loaded to a little bit higher pressure in the 5.56, but really they're very similar ballistically. At least downrange, they're pretty similar. You're not going to be shot at with one and be like, oh, that was a 223, and shot at with another one and be like, oh, that was a 5.56. So you're looking at a very lightweight, high velocity round. And that has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of that is that it's a very flat trajectory. The advantage of that is it gives you a very high muzzle foot-pounds of energy, because if you look at energy is mass times velocity squared, so you get that bumped up velocity, you get a lot more energy on paper, and that gives you less felt recoil generally, with more muzzle energy downrange. So there's the advantage. There's an advantage to a lightweight, high velocity round. The other thing is the lightweight is an advantage in and of itself. Like we talked about, you can carry more. So that, an AR round compared to an AK round weighs less. So if you say, we're not machines, even with a machine, there's a limit to how much something can carry. And do you want, 120 rounds of 223 ammo, 5.56 ammo, or do you want 80 rounds of 7.62 39 ammo? for the same weight. So there's an advantage there just in weight alone. And like I said, the AR was designed to wound. If you're going to design to wound somebody, if you hit them and you wound them with the AR-15, or you hit them and you kill them with a 7.62x39, it's kind of a win as far as the American military was concerned for both. So that's the high velocity round. So let's look at in comparison, the contrast to that, the Russian round, the 7.62x39. 7.62 millimeter obviously is bigger than 5.56 millimeter. It's a 30 caliber versus a 22 caliber. So a much bigger bullet. You're looking at, in a grain weight, you're looking at a 55 grain bullet compared to 123 grainish is about the loading for the general military cartridge adopted by the Russians. There are different loads, obviously, but the average one you're going to see is right around 123 grains. So it's far more than double the round that the U.S. military adopted. So you have a round that weighs more than twice as much, and it's traveling at right around 2,000 feet per second, 2,100 feet per second out of your general AK-47. Right in that ballpark. A lot of things make a difference. The temperature outside makes a difference. Barrel length makes a difference. But let's call it 2,100 feet a second with a 123 grain bullet. So you have a bigger, heavier bullet that's moving about 30% slower, but it's twice as heavy. So you have advantages to that too. A big, heavy, slow bullet tends to fragment less, which means if you're shooting through barriers and barrier penetration, it's better. Also, a bigger, heavier, slower moving bullet generally penetrates better. It does better through obstacles. And it just hits harder. I know on paper, foot-pounds of energy, a lighter, faster bullet will have more energy foot-pounds on paper, but I've shot enough living things to know that a big, heavy bullet has its advantages in real-world applications. A big, heavy, slow bullet hits hard. Think of it like a Ferrari going, or what's even smaller than a Ferrari, let's say a Porsche going at 150 miles an hour hitting a concrete wall versus a Mack truck going at 45 miles an hour and hitting that same wall. They do different things, but both pretty much destroy a wall. It's kind of just which one do you want and how do you want to destroy that wall. A few more things to touch here on the ammo. For your standard military loading for the AK-47, you're going to have a steel case. And for your AR-15, M16, you're going to have a brass case. A couple of different advantages to those. The brass case is reloadable. Steel case is cheaper to produce, so you get kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other there. Now, yeah, I'm speaking in generalities. You can get steel case ammo for 223, usually made in Russia, and you can get brass case ammo made for the 7.62-39 AK. You could also get an AK in 223, and you could get an AR-15 in 7.62x39 and make it even more confusing. But we're talking about the basic, down and dirty military version of both. Another thing worth mentioning is if you look at both cases, the 7.62x39 has a pretty dramatic taper. And if you think about that as the way the gun functions, when the gun goes off, since it's more of a cone shape, that round only has to move backwards a little bit and it pretty much easily extracts out of the chamber, even if it's dirty or nasty or the ammo's cheap, whatever. Because of the shape of the round, just inherently, when it starts to move backwards a little bit, it just kind of comes right out of the chamber. Whereas an AR-15, it's not a straight wall case, but it's much, much straighter. So that if it does expand and that chamber is dirty or the extractor is not working properly, it does get stuck in that chamber easier than a highly tapered case. So some things to consider on the ammo there. Let's talk about next some of the changes over the years. So the AR-15, the M16 has gone through many changes. The most common one you'll see today isn't even an AR-15 M16 type weapon. It's an M4 type weapon, a carbine. So you're dropping from that 20-inch barrel that it was designed for to that 16-inch barrel. And I don't know if you guys are super aware of ballistics, but when you chop that barrel down, you lose a lot of velocity because less powder is burned inside the barrel, which means you're giving up some of the potential energy of that cartridge. So, one second here, folks. I'm on a pretty bumpy dirt road. So let me get through these bumps. Okay, paved road again. So, you're dropping velocity, so you're kind of giving up some of that high velocity advantage we talked about earlier when you're chopping that barrel down 4 inches. So you're dropping down generally into the 2,800 foot per second range with that same bullet. Another change that has dramatically happened is the standard military loading anymore isn't even the 55 grain, it's the 62 grain. There's a couple of iterations, the XM855 I believe. That's what I used when I was overseas deployed in combat. That's the green tip commonly referred to. It's got a little bit different construction, but for all intents and purposes, you've bumped it up a higher grain weight from 55 to 62, and you've also again dropped that velocity down. So be aware of that. Yes, you're getting a bigger, heavier bullet, which has its advantage over the 55 grain, but you're giving up that velocity, and you're still nowhere near in the ballpark of the AK standard 123 grain. On that note, you can also bump up that 123 grain. I have a couple 154 grain AK loads at the house that I really like, soft points. But that's some of the changes that the AR-15 has gone through over the years. Different barrel contours. It's gone from a pencil barrel in the beginning, which was lighter weight, to the Marines kind of wanted to go to the A2 profile, which is much heavier. So you kind of give up some of that weight advantage over the AK that you had in the beginning. We've gone through those iterations of much heavier, thicker barrel. Even on the M4, the barrel is shorter, but it's still thicker than the original M16A1 barrel. So it's gone through those changes. It went from your standard 20-round magazine to your 30-round magazine fairly early on. So you have that. And we're talking about, again, your average basic AR-15 M4 type. There are so many different variations of the AR-15, the M16. Literally, there's an entire podcast, the AR-15 podcast, literally just about that platform or rifle. So we obviously can't cover that in this one episode. And the AK has gone through less changes. Going back to the M16 AR, one of the big changes is going from fixed iron sights, because optics weren't a thing back in the 50s the way they are today. They existed, but they weren't a common everyday thing on a battle rifle the way they are today. So it's gone from the carry handle regular iron sights, which are great sights, to the removable carry handle or just a straight flat top upper, letting you mount optics, whether it's a red dot or a low power variable optic, or your basic 3-9 scope for hunting. Whatever the optic is, it's kind of going through that change. Your average AR you'll get today will not have fixed carry handle iron sights. It'll have some kind of flat top Picatinny rail on it. The AK has gone through some different changes as well, but the same basic AK is pretty much the same from a couple of different versions of the AK. Mostly what we call today the AK is actually the AKM. I won't get into the difference in that, but you can still get your basic wood furniture, iron-sighted AK, and it's still a damn fine fighting weapon, still a good fighting rifle. It doesn't lend itself as nearly as well to the AR for modifications. It's a lot harder to get a good, repeatable, holding zero mounting system for the AK. I'm not saying you can't do it, you certainly can, but that is what it is. So, which one's better? I guess that's the reason you tuned in, right? The AR versus the AK. And obviously, we're not going to settle that today. That really depends. I'll tell you from personal experience that I have had catastrophic failures, both in combat and in training with the AR-15 M16. And not cheap variants either. Like, these are all the ones I can think of were actually military or government issue, the Colts or the FNs, which are a good quality weapon, but just the inherent design flaws of that weapon. I've had a couple of catastrophic failures, meaning that you couldn't fix it on the fly. You couldn't just do remedial action, tap, rack, bang. Like, something catastrophically broke in that weapon that made that weapon be out of the fight. And I've had that. I've never had that with the AK. I've never had that with an AK at all. And to be fair, I've had a lot more training time and trigger pulls behind an AR than an AK, but it's, I think, common throughout that you get more of those kind of failures with an AR. And you may, say, oh, I've never had one with an AR. Well, I don't know how much you shot, but if you shoot eventually, you will. Just from the nature of it, the design of that rifle, you're blowing that gas back into the moving parts of that gun. And the gun is just, yes, they can be very, very reliable weapons, but they need to be taken care of more and cleaned more and maintained better than the AK, and I don't think anybody will argue that. So there is that. The AR is more ergonomic. So the way the controls work, if you're running it on a clock in a competition, there's a reason in 3-gun all the champions use the AR pattern rifle. It is faster on the clock. It is faster to do mag changes in. You can get really fast with both. But, when you have to do less, you can do it faster. You can complete the task faster the less steps there are. And for that reason, running it on the clock, reloads, things like that are faster. Because it shoots a lighter bullet, just in general, I don't think anybody will argue that the AR-15 is going to have less recoil, which means your shot recovery time, your shot, whether it's transitioning from target to target or your time putting multiple hits on target is less. So there is that for the AR-15 M16. The AK hits harder. I don't think anybody will argue with that. Some people might, but the AK hits harder. So do you want more rounds on target quickly, or do you want less rounds that are more effective? Which one do you want? Do you want to be able to carry more rounds with less weight, or do you want the rounds that you fire to be more effective? Terminally speaking, for terminal ballistics. What are you trying to do? Do you envision yourself in a scenario where you can't maintain a weapon, or where you do have to? I'm not saying you should never maintain your AK. You certainly should clean them and keep them up, but there are plenty of really neglected AKs in Africa and the Middle East and other places in Asia and the world that have been running just fine for decades. You're not going to see that with AR-15s. So if you envision yourself in some kind of long-term scenario in an environment that's fairly abusive to the gun without any kind of maintenance regiment, that might lead you towards the AK. What I'm trying to say is it really just depends. If there were a clear winner, which one is better? If one was amazingly awesome at everything, the other one was junk, then we would only have the one. This debate wouldn't be raging on for decades. The point is, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're both good. So a couple of things tying into this. What do you want the rifle for? Because there are scenarios where either one would be better. If you told me that, I'm just making up a scenario here. If you told me you were going to drop me off on some alien planet, I don't know what it is. There's some kind of hostile alien creature there. Don't know what it is. Could be alien dinosaurs. Could be alien zombies. No idea. You don't know if it's going to be jungle. You don't know if it's going to be desert. You don't know if it's going to be a forest. You don't know what kind of environment it's going to be in. We're going to drop you off with a knife and a case of MREs and a crate of ammo and a rifle of your choice. It has to be an AR or an AK. Which one are you going to take? I take the AK for that. If you told me that today in your city there's going to be an active shooter, we don't know how far the distance is. You could have to do room entries and stop that active shooter. We don't know if it's going to be one active shooter or 5 active shooters, like a Columbine type situation. You might have to shoot a hostage shot. You may have to shoot across a long thoroughfare or from one building to another. Maybe some kind of, counter sniper type thing. We don't really know. We just know there's going to be an active shooter today. You have one rifle in your car, in your truck, whatever it is. You can choose the AR or the AK. Which one's it going to be? For that, I choose the AR. So, assuming I've had training on both and I've zeroed both, and I could pick the optic or whatever, I would pick the AR for that. It's a better tool for the job on both cases. So that's up to you. Say if you can afford it, get both, train with both. Also tying into that, what's your personality? What kind of man are you? What kind of gunfighter are you? If you're a lady gunfighter, well, what kind of lady are you? What kind of gunfighter are you? Are you the kind of person that just wants to buy the rifle and pick it up and train with it and use it to the best of its ability, and when you're done, put it down? If you forget to clean it, whatever, the rifle is what it is. It does what it does, and it does it all the time, and it does it well. And you're just gonna, no fuss, pick up a rifle and it has to do what it needs to do when it needs to do it, I'd say get the AK. If you're the kind of guy that wants to squeeze every advantage out of his weapon, and, if I get my highly tuned precision, Daniel Defense AR and it's not running reliably, then you know what? I'll identify that in training and I will drop in a super high speed titanium nitride coated bolt, and I'll switch from CLP to this fancier gun grease, and that'll fix the problem. And with that, it'll run reliably for 200 rounds at a time, and I know after that I have to clean it, but in those 200 rounds it's perfectly fine and serviceable and reliable. And I'm going to replace the extractor every 1,000 rounds, every 5,000 rounds, whatever it is. I'm going to do that, and I want to drop the fanciest 1 to 8 power scope on it and see how far I can get hits out to 800 meters with the right loaded ammunition and the right zeroed gun. And I want to spend my time and effort getting the highest tuned precision thing, and I'm going to tinker with it. Then I'd say the AR is the way you're leaning. That's the kind of personality that you are. Like I said, it really just depends on you. Which one is better, for what and for who, I guess, are the big questions. The other thing I'll close with for this is they're not the only two rifles in the world. Everybody, it seems like I said, it's America's rifle. Everybody in America, go to the AR. Well, like I said, what are you going to do with it? If you're mostly a hunter, mostly a farmer, or a rancher, I would say neither one of those. I would say look really towards the, Ruger Mini 14. They call it the ranch rifle for a reason. If you're mostly going to hunt and stuff with it, say the Mini 14 or the Mini 30, you can get it in either one of those calibers, the AR caliber or the AK caliber. I'd say if you're going to do mostly hunting and mostly, pest control, varmint control, and you might occasionally want it to pull double duty as a defensive gun in a defensive shooting type environment, that Mini 14, Mini 30 is a great gun. I use them on duty. I use them as a law enforcement officer, even when I had the option of choosing between that and an AR. Even a full auto M4 carbine, I had the choice, and I sometimes would pick the Mini 14, but depending on the mission. So it really depends on what it is. Don't think that they're the only two rifles. You're going to be traveling a long distance for whatever reason with the ammo you can carry on you, and you want a defensive type rifle. Maybe you want the FN P90, PS90. Maybe that's what you want. It really depends. Don't think that they're the only two rifles that exist. You said you're going on a hiking / trail riding trip with horses in the backcountry of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Sawtooth Wilderness. You might run into some unsavory characters. You might need it for defense, but you're mostly going to use it for hunting and putting food on the table, and it has to be a rifle. You might go with your old school lever action 30-30, Marlin 336, or your Winchester 94. So, whatever, that rifle might suit you better for that. Depends on what you're going to do. You may go with a scout rifle, old school bolt action. Don't think that they're the only two rifles that exist. I guess is in closing. There's a lot of other good platforms out there, and I obviously can't go through them all. There's so many variants of both too. You can get an AK that's built to be a lot more like an AR, and you can get vice versa. You can get ARs in all different calibers. You can get AKs in different calibers. You can get AKs that take AR furniture. I mean, you can mix and match, I guess. So it really depends on, like I said, what kind of person you are, what kind of personality you are, and what your mission is. But I would say, at the very minimum, if you're a gunfighter, you need to train with both. You never know what weapon you're going to have at the time. Obviously, you want to be able to pick and choose your weapon and control the situation completely, but that's not the world that we live in. There was, like I said, there was times in Iraq, a real world example, where my AR-15, it wasn't an AR-15, it was an M16 A2, it literally went down, catastrophic failure. It would not work until I got it to an armor. I literally picked up an AK-47 and it worked, and I was happy with the trade. It was a crude weapon, but it always worked. I never had one let me down. So there's a real world example. You need to know both and train with both, know the manual of arms for both, and then make a more informed decision. Which one do I want? What's the mission? What do I want to do with it? So I guess that's it in closing. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. You always get naysayers and people that have drank the Kool-Aid from one firearm or the other. It's got to be the AK. It's the best battle implement ever devised. It's got to be the AR. The other thing is junk. You get both camps. But I would say if you're going to trust your life on something, don't do it based on emotion. Do it based on your training and your experience, and use the right tool for the job. Like I said, I've trained with both. I've got a lot more trigger time behind an AR, but there's a lot of missions where I would choose an AK over it. So, what's your mission? What kind of person are you? Are you going to make sure before you go to bed every night that the AR is well oiled and well lubed and taken care of? Is it going to stay in a climate-controlled environment in a case? Then, that is what it is. Are you going on contracting work over in Iraq, where you don't know if you're going to be able to maintain your weapon or what kind of ammo you're going to be able to get? So the mission really depends. And that depends on what kind of rifle you should pick. I hope that you never need to use it in real world, but if you do, you have the right tool for the job, and I hope that God blesses you with another day. I also thought it would be good to tie into this episode the 5.56 versus 7.62 by 39, a little bit more in-depth look at those two rounds. All right, get ready for some controversy. Today's episode may be more divisive than most other Cartridge versus episodes. Today, we are comparing the top 2 intermediate cartridges of our time for right now. And since the Cold War, really. So, Cold War, 1960s and on. I know the Cold War started before that, but we started using this cartridge. The other one predates it. You may have guessed by now, we're talking about, in one corner, the Red Army cartridge. The 122/123 grain. 7.62 by 39, the Red Army cartridge. First in the SKS, but most notably by far the AK-47 platform round. And in the red, white, and blue corner, from America and adopted by NATO, the 5.56/223 cartridge. At most commonly 55, 62, and now the heavy hitter 77 grain. This is going to be a controversial episode. I'm going to come at this from hopefully a fair and objective point of view. Now, obviously, I'm American. I have fought for this country. I have been to war more than once for this nation. I fought with an M16. The first time for the invasion of Iraq with an M16A2. And then later, with my last deployment, up to the M16A4 in the United States Marine Corps Infantry. However, I consider myself pretty unbiased in this, in that my M16 and that round had a catastrophic failure right in the middle of an invasion. Catastrophic failure meaning like it couldn't be fixed. It wasn't a tap rack bang scenario. It wasn't a double feed. It wasn't even a bolt override. It was had to go to an armorer. Gun was broken. And I carried an AK for a time during the war. We'll call it a more specialized assignment. Operating in Baghdad. I was very blessed during the war that God kept me safe. I don't know that blessed is the right word to describe this, but I had a very unique opportunity to be in Baghdad just before it collapsed. During the invasion, we, let's say, got there early. I operated out of a safe house, I don't think is saying too much, with some other people. And I carried an AK for a short time. And I really liked that weapon. So, and I've got experience with both since then. And I know enough about ballistics. If something's better, if a round's better, I don't like to trust my life to things based on what's cool on Instagram or based on sentimentality. So I think we all have our own biases and things like that. But if you think that I'm just going to be, because it's American all the time, saying that the 5.56 is better, I'm not. For some things, I'll be honest, I think it is better. And for some things, I think 7.62 by 39 is better. With that said, with that preamble, long and drawn out, and all the caveats, because I know this is probably going to be a controversial episode, let's get into the topic du jour. What does that mean? That's the topic of the day. That sounds good. I think I'll have that. Let's talk about these two cartridges. Both intermediate cartridges. Neither one the first intermediate cartridge. I'd say neither one the first successful warfighting intermediate cartridge, but the two dominant ones, again, since the Cold War and into today. Intermediate meaning it is somewhere between, I'm using the traditional term of intermediate, it's in between a full-powered rifle round, contrary to what the media or you may have been told if you just got into guns recently. The 5.56 is not a very powerful round compared to most traditional rifle rounds, even compared to like a 243, which is a very, I would say, on the minimum end of the scale for deer hunting. It's much less powerful than a 243. Or the 7.62x39 is far less powerful than its full power counterpart, the 7.62x54R. It shoots a lighter bullet at less velocity in both cases. It's an intermediate. It's between, or let's say below, a full-powered rifle round, 7.62x51 NATO or 7.62x54R Russian, and it's well above traditional pistol rounds, whether that be 45 ACP or 9x19 9mm. It's far more powerful than that, but far less powerful than most traditional full-powered rifle rounds. It's an intermediate round. Both of them are with different philosophies. And I should say, from what I know, by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. From what I understand, the Red Army traditional rifle cartridge for a long time, since World War I and before, the main infantry rifle cartridge, the 7.62x54R, that's a full power rifle cartridge. They wanted an intermediate rifle cartridge. They saw the distances that engagements realistically were happening. See this on pretty much every side, and starting in World War I, they had these rifles marked out, the Russians and Martians, which I think, and a little aside, is an ingenious term of measurement, marked out to like 1,000 Martians or even farther. And us in the American military and the Brits, they had these really long distances marked out on the rifles. And then they realized in World War I and World War II that engagements usually happen a lot quicker and a lot closer than that, especially in urban warfare, which is a mainstay of modern warfighting. And they looked at the common engagement distances, and they started moving more towards and mass issuing more semi-automatic and submachine gun type weapons. The Soviets looked at this, and they developed a cartridge, same caliber, same 7.62, which in the Russians is a little bit different than ours, should be .3112 diameter bullet. But, close enough to .308. And they said, let's keep this bullet diameter, let's shorten it, make it more compact, let's make it good out to reasonable ranges, 300 meters. And they made the 7.62x39. Now, if you are familiar with European designations on cartridges, after the X, the number is the length of the case in millimeters. 54 is quite a bit more than 39. And that has to deal with your cartridge powder capacity. It's far less powerful, but still pretty potent. You look at that 39 versus, and it's not the same because pistol powder versus rifle powder is different, but to give you a rough idea, versus a 9x19 versus 54, you got the 39. It's right in there. It's an intermediate cartridge. And they did a good job. It has proven itself so effective that I would just be guessing at the number of nations that adopted it. Now, part of that was due to the Soviet Union, but we still see countries today that haven't been part of the Soviet Union for a long time using 7.62x39. Why? Because it works. And it works well. Most engagements are 300 meters and in. It's not such a big and heavy cartridge that you can't have 30-round magazines with it and carry a full combat loadout. And it's effective. It's effective at those ranges. It's effective, again, first came out in the SKS, which is a fantastic rifle, but most notably in the AK. So that pairing was very effective and has been and continues to be effective. Now let's look at the Cartridges of the World book. I like to keep, that was a gift from a patron. If you want to become a patron and support the podcast, there should be a link in the show notes. Anyway, I'm going to go to Cartridges of the World, and I'm going to try and keep it pretty fair and go to similar sources. I don't want to favor one even inadvertently over another. This manual, the Cartridges of the World, lists a military load, 122 grain. You'll often see 123 grain. It's academic difference, really, at 2329. 122 grain, 2329 at 1470 for foot-pounds of energy. All right, now let's talk about the 5.56. And I know there are differences. Between the 5.56 and 223. I'm very aware of that. But for today's discussion, let's say for downrange performances, the differences are academic. In real world, it really makes no difference. Make sure you can fire appropriate ammunition out of your rifle. If you blow yourself or somebody else up inadvertently, it's your fault, not mine. Now, let's talk about the 5.56, because we went a different route. Instead of taking the 30-06, which we had, or shortly after that, the 7.62 by 51 NATO round, the 308, for all intents and purposes. Again, put the right ammo in the right gun. But instead of making a shorter version of that, which would have given us something fairly or much more similar to the Soviet round, we decided to go a, let's say, for the time, pretty radically different way. And by we, I'm talking AR Stoner designed the AR-10, later AR-15. I'm sure other people had a hand in it. To the Defense Department, Air Force took a look at it. They said, we like what you're doing here. Anyway, for all intents and purposes, prior to this, these very high velocity, small caliber rounds were known as varmint rounds. And that's really where they exist today in the civilian market, aside from ARs and stuff. If you look at really small bore, high velocity rounds, in general, outside of this arena, we're talking about hunting, you're talking about varmint rounds. And it still is a fantastic varmint round. Instead of just getting a similar diameter bullet and making it a little bit less powerful, they decided to go with a much smaller diameter. You're talking 22 caliber. Initial loadings, I believe, in 55 grain. We just mentioned the Soviet round in 122 grain, which is already quite a bit lighter than their full power round. But this, 55 grains. Now, when NATO settled on it, they went to a 62 grain. But even so, 62 grain, that's, for rough math, right? That's about half. And you might think, well, that's quite a bit less powerful. Well, hold your horses. I said high velocity. Whereas the Russian kind of idea was to take a similar diameter bullet and a little bit less weight and a little bit less velocity. Americans, let's get a small diameter bullet and push it to really high velocities. So we look at this list of military load in the cartridges of the world. 55 grain, full metal jacket, boat tail at 3250. And with an energy of 1290. So again, 55 grain, 3250 at 1290. I do believe these are going to be out of a 20-inch barrel per the M16. Today the M4 is much more common. You're going to drop some velocity there, but let's stick with these numbers for a minute. And I mentioned that NATO settled on the 62 grain. This doesn't list the 62 grain military load, but it lists the 62 grain commercial load, which should be fairly similar at 62 grains, 3,000 feet a second, with 1239. Now, if we look at the most energy of both those loads, 1290 at the 55 grain, it's still less than the load we quoted for the 7.62 by 39, which came in at 1470. So if you quantify energy with foot-pounds, right? Force equals mass times velocity squared. Then just on pure power, the Soviet round gets it. It's more powerful. You can argue with that and throw a fit, but if you quantify that the way that physics quantifies that, then the Soviet cartridge wins. I didn't say more effective, so settle down. I said the most energy, foot-pounds. And that's comparing that load to a 20-inch barrel. You're going to lose quite a bit of velocity, which the 5.56 depends on going to a 16-inch barrel, which I'd say today is far more common. The Marine Corps still sticks to their 20-inch barrel, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. But most of the rest of the military, the Army, and things like that have gone to the M4, the 16-inch barrel. And the AK-47 has basically always been, let's call it for argument's sake, a 16-inch barrel. I looked up two sources outside of that, one of them being Wikipedia. And pretty close if you drop down, just for argument's sake, to the 16-inch barrel, you're looking at around 28 and some change for that most common today NATO round, the M855 62 grain. So you are giving up some velocity going to the more common 16-inch barrel, and you're obviously, by that measure, going to give up some energy and some power. That's how that works. So if we look at pure power, most powerful cartridge, the AK round is going to get that, right? The 7.62 by 39 is going to get that. And that makes sense, and that bears out what I've seen in real life. Round for round, the 7.62 is more powerful, round for round. Now let's talk about the philosophies of this. They're quite a bit different, right? A bigger, heavier, much closer to traditional rifle bullet weight at a moderate velocity. That's kind of the AK philosophy. The 5.56 NATO philosophy is let's get a lightweight, small caliber projectile and push it really fast, which is going to give us our lethality, our effectiveness. Lethality is probably not the right word because I don't even know that that's what's most important on a battlefield. You want to take an enemy soldier out of the fight. Killing them or not is kind of inconsequential to you. You're not there to murder people. You're there to win a confrontation. Come out on the winning side of that. We talked about power. I think the 7.62-39, just however you want to measure that, gets that. Now, let's talk about power to weight ratio. And the clear winner there is the 5.56. I think that was the main reason they were looking at this round. You could carry more ammo with less weight. And if you've ever been a soldier, a Marine, rucking, humping, tremendous amount of weight, as we had to, it sucks. It's miserable. If you can lighten up a little bit of that weight, I think that greatly increases combat effectiveness. The heaviest part of a round is the projectile, especially when it's made of lead. There are other components, the brass or steel, and the powder and the primers, but lead is heavy, right? And there's some new lead-free rounds and things like that, but the projectile weight adds up. 7.62 by 39 ammo is heavier, and the magazines, for that matter, without getting too much off topic, are heavier. So a 30-round mag of 7.62-39 weighs more than a fully loaded mag of 5.56. This should come as a shock to no one. So power to weight ratio. You start strapping a soldier, a Marine, a comrade down with whatever, body armor, helmet, radio, a couple of grenades, first aid gear, all that stuff adds up quick. Let's say the allotted amount that a soldier can move freely with and carry combat effective amount of ammo, let's say it's 50 pounds, and I'm just making up a number. Let's say 50 pounds of that is allotted for ammo. Well, you can carry a lot more ammo in that 50 pounds if it's 5.56 versus 7.62 by 39. So again, power to weight ratio, I think that clearly goes to the 5.56. Again, that's a big reason I think they adopted it. You can carry more ammo, certainly more than the 7.62 by 51, the NATO round that preceded it. Alright, now let's do a deep dive into a couple more of the aspects of these cartridges. Recoil. Now, neither one of these is what you would call a heavy recoiling cartridge. I will concede that. And some people, because of that, will go, 7.62 by 39 recoil is nothing. But it's not nothing. It's something. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you have more energy going out of the front of the barrel, you have more energy coming back into the shooter, you, or whomever that shooter might be. And I don't care how good you control recoil, and you can control recoil very well. If you reduce the recoil, you can shoot a given target size, all other factors being equal and are generally not. Assuming you're up to the task and your body mechanics and your fundamentals are good enough, you can get repeated hits on a target or shoot multiple targets faster with less recoil, and that has real world advantages. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have, I'm going to use an AR for this. You could easily just use an AK in both calibers, but let's say you have an AR, and they do make ARs chambered in 7.62 by 39 and 5.56. Let's say you have two guns. Other than the chambering, mostly they're going to be different, right? But mostly identical. Same weight, same barrel length, same optical sight. You got an aim point on top of both. Both are zeroed to the exact same target you're shooting at. We're going to even negate that. Let's say you have a man-sized target, 300 meters. How fast you can get 4 hits on target If you have good fundamentals and can take advantage of that recoil, to reduce the recoil, you can do it faster. And you don't know all the time on real-world targets. It's going to be the first round or the second round or the third round that changes that person's behavior. That behavior being them trying to kill me or my friends or my colleagues or my comrades, depending if you're on the other side, right? So if we're talking cartridge to cartridge, there's less recoil in the 5.56. Let's talk about another aspect, trajectory. This is another thing, like you can get mad about it if you want, but the 5.56, 55 grain, 62 grain is going to have a flatter trajectory than the 7.62 by 39. Now 7.62 by 39 is not bad out to 300 meters, but it's not as flat as 5.56. And you can shoot long range with calibers that have really arching trajectories, like a 300 Blackout. If you know the exact distance and you're on a static range and you know your holdover and you can dial it in on a scope. But if we're talking about battlefield conditions, like you got multiple people popping up on a battlefield. One's at 50 meters, one's at 175, and one's at, 285. And you have to engage those targets. Sometimes it's a whole silhouette, sometimes it's just a head and shoulders. Sometimes it's just a head. The ability to have a flatter trajectory and a longer point blank range, meaning I can aim at the center of that given target and hit it somewhere in the acceptable area, is going to be flatter, therefore longer distance, with the 5.56 than the 7.62 by 39. So you got that going for the 5.56. Let's talk about some other differences. If you talk about cartridge dimensions, I think there is a clear advantage to the 7.62 by 39. It's a highly tapered cartridge, which means that aids greatly in extraction. Going back to what I briefly mentioned during the war. As Marines, we were just kind of relentless about keeping our guns clean. Well, if you're in Iraq during the invasion and it's a literal sandstorm going on and you go to use your rifle and you rip the back of the cartridge that's in your chamber, it will not extract. It will not do it. You can't get it done. No matter how many times you run that bolt and that extractor over there, it strips it out, and the force of that round in the chamber is greater than the force of that extractor pulling it rearward. No matter how many times you repeat and do that, that round will not come out. Because if you look at a 5.56 round, there's a lot of surface area in that chamber, and it's not exactly straight all the way to the bottleneck, but it's much less tapered than the 7.62 by 39. The AK is renowned for its reliability for many reasons, but part of that is because of that massive taper in the case. I like that. That's a good design feature. Anything that can aid in extraction and therefore aid in reliability of a cartridge is a good thing. So for cartridge dimensions, I think that kind of goes to 7.62 by 39. Also, there's something to be said for a heavier projectile. I talked about power, and clearly the 7.62 is a more powerful round. But if you look at doctrine, it's not uncommon to be taught in the Marines and the Army to shoot a target multiple times, especially after, the global war on terror, whatever you want to call it. I don't know that you could quantify this, and you can disagree, and that'd be fine, but I would say round per round effectiveness. You're talking about like torso hits on a military age male, I would say that round for round, the 7.62 is not only more powerful, it's more effective. Even though it's going at a lower velocity, it has much more mass. You're talking about double the mass of the projectile. And also, that aids in barrier penetration. Now, you may say, well, NATO's common round is the what we call penetrator round, light armor piercing, got a tungsten tip on it. And you can kind of get around it that way and aid the 5.56 in barrier penetration. But if you're comparing apples to apples, if you were comparing that to a armor penetrating round in 7.62 by 39, I still think it would win. So if you're just talking straight ball round to ball round, you're talking about barrier penetration, whether that be just a Toyota Hilux with a couple of radical Islamic terrorists in the back of it, or a light armored vehicle on the plains of Mongolia, right? The 7.62 by 39, I think, gets a nudge because of that. Here's where we're getting to some gray area. We as America have embraced the 5.56 223 for a long time, and we have some really good rounds now for it. Not just the military rounds, but for a lot of things, civilian rounds are really good, in some cases better. I would never advise you, if you're protecting your home with a 5.56 or it's your truck gun, maybe have a magazine of the armor-piercing stuff, but do not have that as your go-to defensive ammo. There's much better choices. You got a lot of really good soft point ammo. Spear Gold Dot makes a round for the 5.56. A lot of R&D over decades has gone into that round. I'd say more so than the 7.62x39. You can get some good soft-pointed rounds and stuff for the 7.62x39, but not to the extent, I think, that you can. The Black Hill 77 grain, kind of known as the heavy hitter in the AR world. So you get a little bit of advantage there. Just commercialism and capitalism and R&D. I think you get more of that in the 5.56. Even with that, though, if you're talking about a medium game hunting round for deer size game, I talked about this a little bit in the 30-30 versus 7.62x39. The 7.62x39 and its regular guys, you're talking about the dirt cheapest, what most people have, 122, 123 grain Tula, Wolf ammo. It's a poor choice for medium game hunting. Sure, you can do it. Maybe your Uncle Ned's barber one time shot a deer out of his truck with 123 grain full metal jacket, 7.62x39. That doesn't make it a good deer round. But if you are judicious about ammo selection and go to some of the rounded, soft point, really good, more geared towards hunting in terms of performance ammo, the 7.62x39 is a good choice, and it can be a better choice, I think, than even the best of the 5.56. And I know that's going to make people angry because a lot of people hunt and have their kids hunt with 223s and ARs, and you can get really good bullets for that, as we already discussed. And I did a whole episode on hunting with the AR-15. But talking to somebody that's killed a lot of big game animals and has been a professional big game hunter and guide, again, you made the platforms the same. You gave me a Howa Mini Action, which is a bolt action rifle primarily made for hunting, and you said you're going to go out and deer hunt. You can either have it chambered in 7.62x39 or 223. I'm going to take it in 7.62x39. So for that, I think the 7.62x39 gets it. All right, so in summation here, what do I think is the best in 2023 Battlefield cartridge? Not weapon. We're leaving weapon out of this. We're talking about cartridge, right? Because I can get a really good weapons platform. I can get a Galil Ace in 5.56, and I can get a Galil Ace in 7.62x39. And let's just run with that. Let's just assume that was my option. Battlefield weapon. I, for argument's sake, feel the need to go fight, to become a private contractor again and go fight. Go to war. I'm going to pick the 5.56 for a battlefield. If that's my only thing, not like I'm getting dropped behind enemy lines as a paratrooper and I have to scavenge ammo, but like I have a legitimate logistical supply chain. That's not part of it. Just which one is a better cartridge for a modern battlefield? I'm picking the 5.56. I'm picking it because it's got a flatter trajectory and it's got less recoil, and I think I can get faster first, second, third round hits on target. Also, the weight, right? If I can carry the same amount of rounds with less weight, sign me up. So for battlefield implementation, I think the 5.56 is superior. Now, let's look at this. I'm a prepper. I'm a survivalist. I don't apologize for that. Continuing to breathe air is nice. If I'm talking about like a one gun, and this would not be it, right? I've talked about this before. If I was picking one long gun to bug out and start peeing in radiators or fight bad guys armed with chainsaws under an overpass, pick your apocalyptic movie. If I was picking that kind of scenario, like a survival prepper tool, I had to choose one of these cartridges. I wouldn't choose either one to begin with. I would choose a shotgun, and I've talked about that a lot. And if I was not choosing that, I'd probably choose my Scar 17 if you said it has to be a rifle. Because I think 7.62 51 NATO is probably the best all-around cartridge for tactical and hunting and all that stuff, a best crossover. But out of these two, if you said you have to pick a 5.56 or a 7.62 by 39 for survival scenario, and you don't really get any more specifics. For a survival type scenario, I'm going to go 7.62 by 39. If you give me those same two Galil aces, and I like the Galil ace, I've got quite a bit of practical experience with it. For a while, it was my go-to truck gun. And one of the reasons is because I was in charge of a pretty cool assignment in the military where I had a pretty big area of operation between in Idaho, the upper part of Idaho, in between the Washington border and the Montana border, in a just plain government issued ride. And that was a good truck gun because there's a lot of big animals out there. And if I had to choose one of these to hunt and put food on the table, 7.62 by 39 gets the nod. Also, round per round, I think it's more effective. Do I have to carry less ammo? Yes. But if I don't have a supply chain that's supplying me with more and more rounds, again, I go back to I think that round for round, changing an adversary's behavior, round for round, the likelihood is better with the 7.62 by 39. And if I don't have a supply chain, which I wouldn't in the apocalypse probably, right? Supplying me with truckloads of ammo and stripper clips, it's going to have what I have. I'm probably going to go 7.62 by 39. I think it's a better crossover cartridge. It's better at that medium-sized game. I would hopefully have some rounds tailored for that. Know my dope, know my zero, all that stuff. But I think for an all-around survival round, the 7.62 by 39 gets it. So, in summation, trying to come at this objectively, soberly, looking at these two cartridges and giving you an honest, it's still an opinion, but an opinion of mine based hopefully on facts and real world stuff. That's my summation of these two cartridges. I hope you enjoy that about this podcast. If you want to support, you can scroll down to the Patreon link, but also, I don't often mention it. There's a gear shop. You can go to goodshepherdtraining.com. Again, goodshepherdtraining.com. If you don't want to just become a patron and be part of that insider tribe, but you want something tangible for your money, I get that. There's a gear shop at goodshepherdtraining.com. Stuff for both this Gunfighter Life podcast and the Alpha Male podcast. So you might want to check that out. Again, that's goodshepherdtraining.com. With that, the tactical tip of the day. Whether you're talking AR-15s or AK-47s, you have a front sight post, right? It's not like a lot of traditional bolt-action hunting rifles. You have quite a big height over bore, meaning the sights are higher by quite a bit than the barrel of that gun. The front sight will have a section below the front sight. You can make a very crude up-close CQB aiming device by taking an obnoxious color of, let's say, duct tape, bright orange, chartreuse, bright pink if you want to go that route. And you can put a section of that on there. That way, if you're really close, down and dirty, right? Crude aiming of that in urban warfare CQB distances, you can use that as a very crude front sight. Don't worry about its relationship to the rear sight. At very close distances, it makes very little difference. And getting rounds, especially a first round hit on target quickly, is important. So that, also if you don't want to do that, the duct tape can also do a really obnoxious color of white fingernail polish, followed by, again, bright pink, bright orange, chartreuse, fingernail polish. There you go, a manly use for fingernail polish. But making the bottom of that front sight post a bright color so you can index on it quickly. Now, if you want to take a more precise shot, when you go to get a proper sight picture, you shouldn't be able to see it anyway if your front sight is properly aligned into your rear aperture, whether it's a peep sight for the M16 or the more traditional notch sight of the AK-47. You shouldn't see it, so it shouldn't interfere with your more precise shooting. But it can help you quickly drive that muzzle towards the target and get rounds off quick and with an acceptable amount of CQB accuracy. So that's your tactical tip of the day. Tactical verse of the day. Tying into kind of our topic today, Leviticus 19. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You should be fair in all your dealings. It brings to mind another verse. You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a heavy and a light. You shall not have in your house a differing measure, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and a just weight and a perfect and a just measure. Be a man. Stop judging based on emotion or what you want, or because somebody gives you a bribe, or any of those things. Judge with fair and honest judgment. With that, men, thank Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day. So for those of you new to the podcast, I have for years been doing the podcast as kind of my full-time primary thing, and I have dipped into savings. I have cashed out Bitcoin, cashed out retirement accounts, but it has not yet become a full-time income. I say yet. So I'm picking up some extra work, professional gunfighting, as you might imagine, making that mercenary money to stack it up. But the goal is still, God willing, to make this the full-time income. So you're going to hear some more recycled content, some more tactical reload content. I thought of something new for this week, the 20th through the 25th. Go to the Patreon page if you've never been there. Sign up as a free patron. There's a thing to sign up for as a free patron. Now, a lot of that content usually I put out for paid members. But this week, if you're listening to this when it comes out, or in the future, you can go back and listen to this content. The content coming out from the 20th to the 25th every day. There will be a Patreon page exclusive content episode only on Patreon. You can sign up for free. I mean, if you want to sign up as a Patreon member, you've been thinking about it anyway, go ahead. But just to give you a little taste of what Patreon gets, you can sign up as a free member and get that content. So scroll down, hit the link, and get Patreon only content that won't come out on the regular podcast. To give you an idea of things coming out for the Patreon page only that week, End of the World 2024 episode. Water is not everywhere. Practical Tactical Fashion Part 1. Practical Tactical Fashion Footwear. Anyway, that's some content that'll be coming out on Patreon. Patreon only. So go to the Patreon page and sign up. Sign up as a member, check out the content that's only there, and enjoy this tactical reload.